Glory to God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and welcome to Urho The Way. I am Asha Mathai, and welcome to our series on a conversation with Syriac Christianity. I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Erin Walsh. She graduated with her Ph.D. from Duke University in 2019. She studies ancient and late antique Christianity with the focus on the Syriac language and literature. Her current research focuses on the reception of biblical literature and the growth of asceticism within the Eastern Roman and Persian empires. Dr. Walsh is working on a book project examining the afterlives of unnamed New Testament women in Syriac and Greek poetry, highlighting the work of Narsai of Nisibis, Jacob of Serugh, and Romanos the Melodist. She teaches and writes upon a variety of topics in New Testament literature, the history of biblical interpretation, Syriac language and literature, embodied practices, religious poetry, and multilingualism in the late antique and early Byzantine East. She is an assistant professor of New Testament and early Christian literature at the University of Chicago Divinity School. Thank you, Dr. Walsh, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Tell us about yourself. What brought you into the world of Syriac studies?
So it's a bit of a wandering journey. And I think, I always loved the ancient world. I was lucky enough, the school system I went to, we started Latin when I was 12. So I knew I wanted to study classics as an undergraduate. So it really began, my path began through sort of Latin and Greek, with the aim, and I think the hope certainly of my parents, that I would go to law school and do something practical. And then it was really during my second master's degree at Duke that I started taking Syriac my first day. And just a lot of the questions that I had, I think it just sort of blossomed in my study of Syriac. So that's how I sort of came from classics into the study of early Christianity, and then into the study of Syriac through that.
Very good. It resonates with me because I also took Latin in high school for 4 years, and I had a great time with it. So thank you for reminding me about Latin and now with Greek. Now, is the perception of women in the Syriac patristic literature unique within Christendom?
I think the intensity of just the presence of women, female characters in the poetry, I think is heightened compared to other. It's certainly present within Latin late antique poetry and hagiography and Greek literature as well. But I do think there's something special about the Syriac tradition. And I think, Ephraim and his female choirs, I think there's just a wealth of material to dive into here. And I think one of the things that I'm so interested in with this literature is where you have women who may not speak within the New Testament or speak very little, and they have these expanded roles. So I do think that amplification and using women's voices to think about different theological, religious, ethical topics, I think the Syriac tradition has a lot to teach us about that. It's a question that I have explored in classes, and I think in my future work. I taught a course last spring on poetry in the Christian tradition. Mm-hmm. And it was a bit maybe self-indulgent, but we went through Latin early poetry and Greek and Syriac, and then we went forward reading medieval poetry. So we were reading some of the pearl poetry, because of course Ephraim, he loves that image of the pearl, and then from the Acts of Thomas, the hymn of the pearl. And we read that next to, there's a medieval English poem on the pearl. And we just did a whole section on that. So I think this comparison of how this late antique, early Christian poetic landscape there's a different flavor in some of these literature, different literatures. And I think especially if you're looking at Latin poetry, Lactantius and Prudentius, is very interesting, but they're also, I think, having to grapple with the legacy of Virgil and the classical, and the same thing within the Greek. Whereas I think what you see, there's a different relationship to a classical past, and the prestige of poetry in the Syriac world, the respect for it as a medium of doing theology. I think that sets Syriac literature apart.
You said something interesting that kind of differs from, what we see from biblical content, is the fact that Syriac poets gave women voices, versus the others did not. And if they did give voices, do you see that, propagate to other literature later on, like the way the poets gave a voice to women? Do you see other poets following in their footsteps, giving women voices?
That's a great question. And it's something that one of the reasons I wanted to work also on Greek is because Romanos also does this. But there's this sort of, and I think he's an interesting test case of living between Greek and Syriac worlds. I have to think about that more. I think, poets like Jacob really, following Ephraim, it just becomes more and more women and more voices. Narsai, it's much rarer. And one of the other kind of forms of writing that I'm interested in, that I also think Syriac gave women a very special role, is in hagiography. Whereas I don't know, it's not always, one of the hagiographies that I'm working on, the woman doesn't speak, even if she has the author gives her an elaborate backstory and sort of takes the Greek original story and expands it. So I think even beyond speech, there are these ways of deepening these characters that they're doing. And that's why I always, when I teach how early Christians broadly are interacting with earlier literature, there's always a creative engagement. It's never just a passive reception. There's really a amplification that's usually going on. And I think there's entertainment value. I think sometimes we don't take that into account, that people love to listen to poetry, that there's a dramatic part of these, there's something just pleasurable about listening to these beautiful poetic narrations.
You're right. I mean, it's not, St. Ephraim's Hymns on Paradise. It's quite entertaining. And at the same time, you learn a lot from how he looks at the Garden of Eden and the temple. So thank you for that. You're right. There is an entertainment factor to it.
Now, and that's one thing I would add just on that, is that, in the ancient world, even, into the east of the Eastern Mediterranean, theaters were everywhere. In the classical pre-Christian world, that the theater was such an important part. And we have a lot of homilies on this, and even, elements of Jacob. Sort of one of the things that Christians have to grapple with is often a rejection of the theater, classical Greek and Roman plays. But I often think and I think scholars have noted this before, the liturgy, and St. Augustine will say this in the West, is a different type of drama that people are watching. So I often, I try to, with my students, to keep that in mind, that idea that this is a new place of not entertainment, but sort of where art and literature is taking place, an alternative, a holy theater, if you will.
There's an edification to it. There's a learning that is beneficial or different from what we would see in a secular theater, like you were talking about with the other forums. Shall we move to your dissertation? Let's talk about that. Your dissertation is entitled Sanctifying Boldness. Now, could you speak about the boldness in the Syriac tradition, specifically with respect to the role of women historically and today?
Yeah, I think that was one of the things that just caught me in some of the poems that I was reading and translating, was a praise of the woman's boldness. So partly the dissertation grew out of a project that I did earlier, midway into my Ph.D., doing an edition of the manuscripts and a translation of Narsai's On the Canaanite Woman, which hadn't appeared in any of the printed editions. And the praise of her chutzpah, I think, is very interesting, because and different sort of terms for boldness can also be used, to stick with Narsai for a minute, in his speaking about Eve. There's an impudence. I think English, the difference between impudence and boldness I think is an important way that it's not boldness is an unqualified good. It can be used for, it can be an overstepping. But there's also what I saw in Narsai, and Jacob is doing this as well, and different terms I think that Romanos is using. These women they're persistent. The role of boldness in the holy life is, that nothing holds you back from pursuing Christ. And all three of these poets is very much in a pursuit of Jesus, and that is praised. And it's something that, as someone, a lot of my training was as a historian of asceticism in the ancient world, and women in the ancient world. That's one part of my research. We often think about the martyrs, the female martyrs, and female ascetics as women who could transcend or sometimes act in ways that societal expectations about how women would act weren't quite, they could overstep some boundaries in their pursuit of holiness. And I wanted in the dissertation, and I think the dissertation might be more than one book because there's a lot going on. Want to say that how early Christians imagined biblical women, that's another category of women who can press against, can speak in ways that women wouldn't be quite have the freedom to speak, can sort of overstep those boundaries. I think one of the difficult parts of your question is that as a historian, we have these beautiful poems and this literature, but we don't have the voices of live women who, I would love to know how women in the audiences heard these poems when these poets are praising the boldness of these women, or holding them up as a model for all men and women alike to emulate. How did that change how women thought about their own day-to-day lives or ethical situations? I would love to have their testimony of that, but I don't have that as a historian. So, something that I'm often in my classes trying to talk about with students is how this gives us a window. It's not a clear window. It's a window that we have. These are really representations. These are crafted portraits. But as I think feminist historians and historiographers have started to, in the last decades to talk about, is that they give us access to the ideas, the beliefs that shaped women's lives. So there's always a layer. I think we have to be humble about what we can actually say. But I do think, we have to think of creative ways to use the evidence that we have to think about the lives of women and what they were, the messages that they got, and also Christians in general, because these are never held up as, oh, these are only models for women. The poets don't tend to, it is for everyone. And the other thing that I would say in response to that, why boldness, is that I do think it's sort of on the flip side, or it's sort of two sides of the same coin of humility and boldness. I do think there's a spectrum there. And often, I'm working on a piece on Solomon, the women before Solomon, and both women are bold. But one's not, there's a bad way and there's a good way. And both Jacob and Narsai write on this particular piece. And love qualifies the good boldness. And often one of the things I'm interested in, how a mother's love has a particular quality of boldness. And I think all people can see that. We see that in our day-to-day life all the time. So I think that's an interesting thing that they're picking up from probably just women that they would see in their communities.
It's very interesting, the fact that, like you said, that we don't have any written text from women talking about their experience, but we have men writing about these experiences.
Right.
And when you were speaking, it reminded me of the hagiography of the saints, the stories of the saints of Perpetua and Felicity.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right? So bold. Can you talk a little bit about that so our audience has a sense of?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I love teaching the martyr texts from all these different, centuries. And, something that you notice with how these texts are being crafted, these are literary, there's a literary quality to all of, ancient texts. And one of the things I love to teach, maybe it's because I majored in classics, but I love to teach about Roman perceptions about religion, and why Christianity was so countercultural in many ways. And one of the things that they're noted about these texts is that, these are women, slaves, those who in everyday society would not, within, sort of Greco-Roman expectations, would not be expected to act with virtue and courage. Mm-hmm. Our word virtue, from the Latin, means man. That's manliness. That's the model, the societal ideal of who should be the most courageous and the most virtuous. And what these Christian stories are putting forward, what they're showing, is that you have people who society underestimates, who are acting in extraordinary ways. I think in the Perpetua and Felicity has this scene with the father, who's a good traditional Roman, who comes and says, "Think of your child." Mm-hmm. And the respect that one should have within the Roman world for your father is, there's a traditional conservative Roman society, and it's heartbreaking. I try to get to students that this is a heartbreaking scene for this father, where this woman, his daughter, is choosing to be Christian over the ties of family. Mm-hmm. And there's something, it caused a severing of those ties. And we can read these stories and say, oh yeah, they're heroes and they act, and it's sort of, we brush over it. But I think when you read them in light of, the context in which they're written, they're really just extraordinary pieces of literature. And this goes on with, I think the Persian martyr tales have, understanding the society around them. It's not an accident that these authors are featuring women, because it's showing, well, look what Christianity can do. So the life of the martyr has its own persuasive, it's its own argument for Christianity. And the martyr tales will tell us about this, about how it's a visual sermon, it's a visual speech to see these women do these extraordinary things. And the memory, and this is what scholars have written quite a bit about, is that the act of remembering the martyrs is so very, very important, that, even in, talk about the West, and in the East, they're reading these tales even when Christianity is the dominant religion. Even in a Christianized, medieval West, they're reading the Golden Legend is full of martyrs. So I think these texts, these stories, have a life of their own, and still today.
Exactly. And the way these women influence that audience there, like Perpetua and Felicity, when they were in the what would call it, in that stadium, being persecuted, they were influencing those bystanders, watching them, living for Christ. And the story continues to have an effect for us as we read it. So it's this like ongoing inspirational story of how we should live our lives, boldness. So thank you for finding that, the fact that you saw the boldness, because women are not portrayed to being bold. I think of St. Paul, when some people may quote, be quiet, don't speak. And it's a very contrasting picture than what we see in the boldness. So can you make sense of the two? I know St. Paul was talking to that audience of women, but some people may misunderstand and say, oh, women need to be quiet in church versus, women are bold and women can be martyrs.
Yeah, this is, within the larger pre-Christian world, women, especially noble women, were expected to act modesty, pudicity is the Latin term, in ways that, are fitting of a Roman matron, to be quiet. So one's speech, how one dresses, how one comports oneself, all those things are sort of thought through gender and expectations. Mm-hmm. And, I think, those verses from Paul are of course, they're very influential. I mean, they really are. If I was teaching within a course, one of the things that kind of the academic study of biblical literature shows is that these are epistles that were written for particular situations, and they're taken up and universalized. And where, I think there are ways that you can, different ways that those have been read, and sort of the context can sort of, I think, make, and it makes an important contribution to how those texts are read. And I do think it shows a tension within Christian literature between a willingness to, there's sort of a respectability and sort of these received expectations around gender, but also that there are places in which, the life of faith transcends society, or more important than societal expectations. So I don't have a good answer. It's sort of you have to continually grapple with a tradition that has so many different voices and different messages, and kind of the layers of nuance in between. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. So your research, we're going to move to your research. Your research observes how the three poets alternatively depicted transgressive female speech and curbed potential dangers of female audacity, which we spoke about. Is there anything else more you would like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that, I think what's so subtle about what these poets are doing is that there is a way in which they are praising these women for their boldness and making this accessible to everyone. And I think there's an important work there that these poets are saying, these women are not just models for women. There's also, speaking to the men in the audience, this is a model for you as well. This is what good, this is what the pursuit of a Christian life looks like. So I think that's important. And but there's also a way in which, I think I've noticed this, I've been working on Jacob of Serugh's poem on the hemorrhaging woman. And there's a way in which she is both very accessible to other women. I mean, he has this great passage where he imagines her before she goes to the doctors confiding in her female companions, which I think is a beautiful imagining of the story. Of course, she had friends. Of course, there's this idea of the social aspects of suffering and illness, that she's a community around her, that the New Testament author may not have been, didn't have time to fully imagine for us, but the poet is adding that. But there are also means by which I think Jacob is not, they don't come out and say, well, all women should, speak out in these ways or sort of transgress. There's still this balancing of that there are communal expectations about how women, roles. And yet these women, are somehow examples of something else, that there are instances, these extraordinary instances where women are pressing against those boundaries. So I'm still working that out, how I want to think about that. I think, that's something that one has to unfold within a book, about how these are both being curbed, but also being, one of the functions of this poetry, as you said, is its ethical and the moral fruit of the biblical text is being shared or being made more digestible for the audience, and kind of a meditation, a communal meditation on it.
You're right. I mean, when you talk about the bleeding woman, it comes to the fact that she's bold enough to touch the end of Christ's robe for healing, and there's a sense of boldness that it takes a lot of guts to do that. So,
and that's one of the. Go ahead. I was just going to say that's one particular, a couple of articles that I might be writing on that. Romanos, the melodist, his poem on the hemorrhaging woman. I mean, Romanos is a very different style in terms of it's almost all dialogue. But he also enters in, and this is something that Syriac poets do as well, sort of they give us the woman's inner dialogue, which I always find fascinating. And she's, thinking about that. Often it's she wants to reach Jesus, and she's triangulated in terms of, if we think about it as a play between the apostles and Jesus and this woman. And she's thinking about, Peter won't let me near, if he only knew. And I think that inner dialogue, that inner thought process is showing us or modeling for the audience how should one think in these situations. And I'm interested in how these, just like sermons, they're sort of preparing an audience for different situations that they might encounter.
I never thought that. That's pretty good. Thank you for that. Now, going to your dissertation, you looked at 3 poets, and can you tell the names of the poets and why you didn't choose Saint Ephrem? Why was he not looked at?
Well, I mean, in a sense, Ephrem is all over
Yes,
the dissertation.
that's
And
true.
I think, I think each of these poets and the corpora of their poetic output, they're each like a forest, and Ephrem especially, you could just get lost in for the rest of your life. So I think a simple answer is my advisors really wanted me to finish at some point. So I think any sermon or essay or book project, you have to sort of set the boundaries.
Yes.
Give it shape. But why I say I think Ephrem kind of looms over, and not just because I add references of where he's setting the interpretive trajectories, is that I was interested in the world that Ephrem leaves behind. I mean, he's such a giant, and I think one thing that I've said a few minutes ago, but I'm increasingly interested in, is this late antique poetic landscape that he changed. I mean, he changes it. He's just so monumental. And each of these poets, I was interested in how they're receiving. They're sort of they echo Ephrem's legacy, and yet all of them have their own artistic talents. They're not simply repeating what Ephrem does. They're changing, they're working within a certain form, and even within the form for Narsai and Jacob, the Memra, they're using it in a different way. They have their own style. And Romanos is, sort of, I wanted to do a project that opened up the Syriac literature to a conversation. So I wanted to put these 3 poets into conversation, and it would be a lot easier to just write on any one of these poets. I think that's sort of a continual challenge that I have, and as I think about a book project, is how to keep these 3 very distinct poets in a conversation that's sustained. And there are books on each one of these figures. So in a sense, maybe it's a little bold on my part, thinking that I could do this, but I think the way that Syriac studies has changed the history, how we tell the history of Christianity, how we study it, how we study biblical literature. And just this, I think I like to think of myself as this another generation of scholars who are working on this, is that I want to continually put Syriac authors into conversation with Greek and Latin authors. I think the more we sort of open, I can't teach a course without having Syriac literature as a part of it. So I by design, I wanted to open. I think Romanos is just such a great way of showing that it's not just how Greek texts, for instance, were translated into Syriac. There is the direction, the influence goes both ways. And I think poetry, this is a world that's shaped by poetry in a way that I think we underestimate. So yeah, that's a very long answer. It was sort of, it grew out of, I looked at 4, I kind of set, these are 4 New Testament women that I want to look at. These are the 3 poets that I want to, and not all the poets deal with all the women. So the chapters are kind of thematic. So we see, there's like 2 different book projects that I think will come out of the dissertation that I'm trying to sort through now, but not easy. It would be much easier if I just did a separate book on each.
Oh, well, we're glad you did. You did kind of comparison. You brought them into conversation. Now, just remind me and our audience, the timeline is that Ephrem came first and these 3 were afterwards, or was there any kind of fact that they knew each other? Did Jacob of Serugh knew of Romanas? Was there any kind of knowledge of each other, even though they were separated?
Narsai is slightly older, contemporary. And probably, of course, Narsai leaves the school of Edessa and goes to Nisibis. And one of the things that I'm interested in is, and I think I'll probably be doing this more in the future, is when they both write on a text, I love to do a comparison between what they're bringing out of the biblical text separately, because I think there's good reason to, and of course the later history and memory of these figures is that, Narsai begins to write partly because of Jacob, and that there's a back and forth. Ramanas is a lot harder to pin down in terms of what he knew or didn't know. And Manolis Papatzakis, who's going to be giving one of the lectures on Jacob, has just done, just brilliant work on thinking about that we often read Ramanas in light of Ephraim, but perhaps, the person, the poetry that we should be thinking about is Jacob. So he's sort of the youngest of the three that I'm looking at. So I do think it's hard to kind of pin down direct literary influence. Mm-hmm. But I think there's reason. I mean, certainly, certainly, at least for my Syriac authors, the knowledge of Ephraim is there, and probably the knowledge of, writing consciously of one another. I think Ramanas is a bit, I think there's good reason to think that he's aware of what's going on. And unfortunately it would be, his biography is sort of shrouded in legend in some way. And I think there's good reason, and scholars are fairly in agreement that he probably perhaps was bilingual, knew of the Syriac world. And I think it's hard to read his poetry and not think that he's aware of what's going on. And I mean, this is a world that's just suffused with poetry. Even the Greek writers, the Cappadocians, they've memorized Homer. So even classical poetry, this is just alive within this. So references are always, I often have students who want to do direct citations. I'm like, there's more. There's these echoes. These allusions can be so subtle.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And with these three poets that you chose, Saint Jacob of Serugh, Romanos the Melodist, these are these authors. You see them of three different communions. Is there something in their works that can contribute to the modern ecumenical dialogue? I know.
That's a great question. And it's something that I'll be thinking about in the future as well. I think partly, I think there are, in terms of the doctrinal Christological questions that I think have often been brought to these authors, or not often, because there's not as much scholarship as there should be done on these three poets. I did want to take a slightly sort of different angle. I really wanted to focus on the exegetical, the interpretive, the way that they're handling biblical literature. So I think one of the ways that I'd like to pursue that in the future, and I think, tracing it in some of my work, is how do they script this encounter with Christ? And they each use different images. And I think that when you're working with poetry as the mode of doing theology, the privileged mode of doing theology, I think the imagery, the ways that Christ is being described, Jacob loves the treasury. That's one of, sort of the infinite treasury that is, how he imagines Jesus is sharing in God. He's the access point for encountering God's abundance. Whereas, Narsai is a slightly different, different images, different ways of scripting this encounter. So I wonder, in terms of the theological work, that partly I think my work can sort of contribute to, is to think about how it's the figure of Christ. I focus on these women, but it's really a way of talking about how this human divine encounter is being scripted. So even though I focus on these female characters, the reason I chose these stories is because that each one of these stories is about humanity before Jesus, before Christ. So I wonder whether the interpretive exegetical discussion, and that I think there's commonality. So I don't look at the poetry that is explicitly polemical, explicitly, I think, and try to look more subtly at how they're imagining this. So it's a great question. It's something that I should think about more. And someone like Ramanas is very oblique, in how he deals with some of these issues. And even though, I think how he's often read is that he does have kind of there are christological moments, and there's a way that he is teaching a type of doctrinal form. But it's much more subtle, I think.
Something you said about echoes,
Mm-hmm.
How the poets, your students are trying to find a citation, and you say there's an echoes. There's, it's just like this big sauce. There's an echo to it. There's a feeling that it has a little bit of Old Testament feel. When you think of Exodus writes the encounter of Moses going up to the mountain and the people and the Exodus, and then later on you have Isaiah and those talking about, it's almost like an echo of that experience of going up to the mountain. Do you see like this connection of and there must be with Judaism, with the Old Testament, of how these poets are writing? It's almost
I think with this question, what I sort of am thinking about is this, the way that the Bible functions in all of these authors and in early Christian authors generally. I think we tend to be very textual. We think I have the Bible sitting on my desk and I can flip it open and look up a citation or an image. And I do think within the ancient world, not very, small percentage of the population can read, has access to the text. But that doesn't mean that it's not a world shaped by writings and texts. People have internalized these stories and know it. So, I think there's a way in which these authors, someone like Ephraim, how he's using the Bible, it's like a mosaic. It's just, he just has all these images, and he's, I think one of the differences between Jacob and Narsai and Ephraim is that Jacob and Narsai tend to stick with one. More of their poems are sort of sustained treatment, whereas Ephraim has that, but he also can do these like beautiful kind of biblical mosaics. So, but I don't always know that it's conscious. It's just part of their vocabulary. It's sort of a part of Ephraim, his literary paint kit that he's just continually flowing out of him because he has so much of it memorized. And that, I think that goes for authors working in Greek and Latin as well. And I definitely think in terms of how, as Christians, they're reading, the Hebrew Bible, their Old Testament texts, they're continually reading that in conversation with the New Testament text, that there's this fancy term, recapitulation of what is happening. So it is one continual narrative that they are drawing from. So I think exactly what you're saying is that they're hearing these echoes, they're seeing these connections. I often, I've told my students, to think about like when you tie your shoes and you have to tie the laces together through the little holes. Often when they're identifying types, or they're saying, Joshua or Moses is a type of Christ, it's like they're tying tighter together their biblical literature into this one narrative framework. So it's all over. I read it with the biblical text next to me, and I'm looking for all these subtle changes. And I think we have to take a step back and think about these poems not just as interpretations, as a commentary genre, but it's biblical storytelling. And that's happening within the synagogues, there's a whole, the larger landscape of late antique poetry, and there's excellent work being done on this. Puytine literature. Within, so this is a larger world of telling biblical stories through poetry. So you can just imagine these worlds just resonating with poetry in these different communities that are side by side. It is an extraordinary thing to think about, and I think one of the questions that I often have is, especially when I'm reading Jacob, because he has these beautiful prologues and sort of prayerful prologues, and I'm always wondering about how his audience thought about his words in relationship to the biblical text. And I don't think he confuses it. I mean, he's not, claiming, I think, the same authority, but there is that you are, I mean, it's more of a spectrum. I think I think there is just like ancient poets invoke the muses, he's invoking the inspiration of God. So it's flow, it's sort of a extension, maybe is the good word, of the biblical text, which is very different than how we think about the commentary genre. So that's a very long answer to your question.
You're right. I recently read something with Jacob Serugh, Bishop Alexander Golitsyn, the Isaiah, the Chariot.
Yeah.
The Chariot, and the fact that you said the extension, it feels like it's becoming 3D. There's an extension to it. There's more to it. There's more layers to the story than what we see literally in the text.
And think about with Ephraim, the paradise. You should smell it. It has a topography. I do think there's an imagination that is being exercised. And that's part of being a Christian, is living into that imagination.
Now, I don't know if you can answer this, but why is the Syriac space so into poetry? It seems like it's synonymous, right? You think Syriac, you think poetry, especially with Ephraim and the ones you mentioned. Why did that happen?
Oh, I'd love to know. I do think it's the larger Mesopotamian world. It's the larger. I'm still learning more and more about, I think one of the things is that as many people working in Syriac, I sort of come from the classical world and moving eastward. I do think there's a larger prehistory to be told there. And of course, Sebastian Brock has done some wonderful work with the dialogue poems that have, it's an ancient form that Syriac poets are perfecting in a new way. And I think, some of the questions, some of the ways that I address this question in the class that I taught with students is that I think poets are, I would maybe use the word burdened within especially the Latin world, and maybe to a certain extent the Greek world, in how, of course, Greek and Latin authors, know ancient pre-Christian poetry very well, and they live in a world that's formed by poets. But there is a critique of poets, right, as well, by pre-Christian intellectuals. That it's entertainment, it's literary, and I think someone like Prudentius is doing very interesting kind of theological work, but it has it's sort of a second tier, And I remember, hard-nosed theology is done in prose. And I think that the Syriac world is kind of free of that tradition. But I do think this is harder because I can always when I'm reading Augustine or when I'm teaching Latin or even Greek literature, I sort of have a sense of what they've read. Because the Christian authors are incredibly well educated and have a traditional paideia kind of education. Whereas when my students ask me, well, what is Ephraim reading? Well, the Bible. But it's hard for me to say what else. I think people have done some excellent work on thinking about what some of these authors know. And of course, in later generations, we have more knowledge of what they're reading. But I think in terms of the sort of formative text, it really is the Bible. It really is biblical literature. So I think there's a different... I think it's a great question. It's one that I continually try to wrestle with when I teach. But I do think it's a different, and but we can see in material culture and our history that Greek myths and stories permeated beyond people who could read Greek or know Greek. So I think it's a fraught question. It's something that I want to know more about, but I don't know how much access we have. But but it's certainly the Bible. Certainly, and I think in terms of why poetry. I mean, Ephraim is so influential in how he thinks about poetry as maintaining the proper stature, the proper posture for theological thought, and that is within a posture of prayer and meditation and the liturgy. And I think that sets a tone for all later authors. And certainly there is a change, a shift towards prose at a certain point, but certainly the period I work on, it's this publicly performed liturgical, often liturgical, not always, kind of genre, because that's where theological thinking takes place. Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's wonderful that it I think counterbalances other forms of where theology has taken place. And it's not to say, I think one of the things that happens is that, and I do this in my own work, is that I become so focused on poetry that I forget that they have other genres, whether it's hagiography or the apocryphal acts, that there's a lot of literature. And I think we could all do more work to see it as there's a larger ocean of it. To hold all these pieces together is difficult.
You're right. There's a beauty to the diversity. You know, when you read the Cappadocians, you don't get that poetic sense. You get kind of like that prose straight text. This is what the body's about, or this is what the soul and what have you. So you get that diversity, and it's okay because it still teaches people what they need to know.
I think what's fascinating, I mean, the Cappadocians, I guess that was a special part of my training, but Gregory of Nazareth writes tons of poetry, at the end of his life. And I think, he's a fascinating figure that we dealt with in the class because the Emperor Julian, who is Julian the Apostate, the last pagan emperor who bans Christians from teaching, he says, if you don't believe in the gods, you have no business teaching Homer. And he only reigns for 3 years. But what a fascinating thing that happens within, and of course, Ephraim, right, is aware of him, and Gregory of Nazareth, is that it spurs Gregory and others to offer poetry to say that, not only is the classical heritage part of who we are as Christians as well, but also that we want children children need something to learn, and poetry is that has educational value. And I think, he's someone that we so often, I think we focus on his prose, his homilies, what he is. He's such a pivotal theologian. And I think now, I like to think that there's a poetic turn in scholarship, and maybe Syriac is pushing that looking at his poetry, maybe we've underestimated even in, I think, the Greek world where poetry is doing theological work as well. And I think Romanos, one of the hardest things about Romanos and reading his Greek is his vocabulary. And I think he's aware, he's very, I think he's very well read. I think even though I think some slightly dismissed as not being as well read, but I think he's more aware, and I think his vocabulary betrays that.
Is vocabulary more like the Cappadocians or more biblical? Is it what level is it at?
It's closer. It's very difficult. Just obscure. Not something that if you just knew and one of the ways that he works with the biblical text is he'll do a slightly different word choice. And maybe this is just my sort of interest in language, but I'm always interested in where they're taking the vocabulary from the New Testament, but they might add a little bit something, or they're using more, or, it just takes you more time to go and hunt down his word because it's not something that you would, come across very often. So yeah, I love, and maybe this is, I get lost for I lose the forest for the trees, but sort of, I always think these poets, their vocabulary is so very important. And it's something that, as someone who is working on translations, I always, I try to be consistent and use the same word, but there's word play and there's sounds, and I think that's something I think translation loses. Maybe very good translators can, capture that, and I think translators do the best they can.
Saying about how things are said, Melodos Pascha, that's not supposed to be read, that's supposed to be heard. Yeah. How he would be preaching that to the people. So there's a sense what we lose also when we read, if we should just, kind of recite it.
Yeah, definitely read it out loud.
Dr. Walsh, would you like to take some questions from the audience?
Sure.
One of the last questions that we got was, can you share more on the humanity before Jesus? If I heard right, did you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I think, probably the story that maybe closest to my heart that I love is the Canaanite Woman. Mm-hmm. And one of the interpretive problems or sort of knots that I think anyone preaching on it today or even back then was, well, what does it mean for Jesus to kind of change his approach? But Jesus is divine. So, I mean, how do you explain that shift in what happens? Is this woman persuasive? And one of the things that is we find, or I found in the poetry, is that there's a sense that Jesus knew all along, but he wants to draw out from the woman. He kind of strings her along a little bit. And I was like, no, you got to argue with me. Why? Because there's something revelatory for everyone around to show her boldness. That's why I love it. Sort of like it turns it like all of this is being staged by Jesus. And that's a way for an early Christian author of maintaining that, his divinity, he's omniscient. There's nothing, he knows what's going on the entire time. I think modern interpretation, you see contemporary alternatives to that don't feel so beholden to, they give more that the woman is being persuasive. So I think with the humanity of Christ, you see this very careful balance between what, sort of the divine, what is the plan, what is being sort of revealed. That's that's a really important theme, whether you're talking about Jacob or Narsai or Ephraim, is that there's always, God is revealing through these encounters, through these women. And yet, I think they're meditating also on the humanity. What's that when Jesus shows emotions or when he's sort of making these decisions, that there's something also being revealed in that as well. So I think each one of these authors navigates that differently. And just what Christ's humanity, it's depicted as a letter. It's his body is a letter that is being written on, that God is revealing through us. So yeah, I think it's also within the liturgy, within the force of this poetry is that it forces us to encounter Christ speaking, Christ sort of acting within the world. And that early Christians couldn't get enough of these stories. That's why we have apocryphal literature. That's why, there's sort of a flowering of this, because there's a desire to hear stories about Jesus and the apostles and these holy figures. So, yeah.
I like the word choice you mentioned, drawing, because Jesus also, she asked, how are you going to draw water from the well? You don't have a bucket. And the way that she's drawing her also, that was.
Oh, that's the Samaritan woman. Jacob and Ramanas, just this incredible, that he has to, because he wants to draw her. Like, it's always out of love. It's not just that this boldness we were talking about at the beginning, that these women love Jesus and are drawn, but what I think is often lost is that for these poets, their theology, and this goes back to Ephraim, and even, this is, in other Christian authors as well, is that it's fundamentally about God's love for us, this being this sort of constant reciprocal desire. So I think poetry is a beautiful place for that.
Thank you for that. And last two questions here. How can we read more of your works? You mentioned some forthcoming publications, and what courses are you teaching now?
Okay. Yeah, so I had a couple of essays come out earlier this year in volumes. One was on Narsai, the other is on, it was from the Syriac Symposium that was a few years ago. So yeah, I have a few things coming out. I'll be having a couple of translations in different volumes. So there's that. There is an article that I published that is available online. It's on women, and it's about a new 2-volume collection of Jacob and sort of pseudo Jacob poetry that is available for download online. It's a poem that I translated from it that features Eve grieving. So it's a little different than my normal work. So it'll be more forthcoming. But those are things that recently came out.
Very good.
And I should update my academia.edu. I haven't, I'm not great about updating my online thing. And then in terms of courses, so last quarter, because we're on the quarter system here at Chicago, I taught, for the first time, I taught a course on Syriac literature and its historical context, which was great. I had a lot of undergrads in the course as well, and students from different departments and graduate programs. I also taught a course on dialogues, sort of in the form of Platonic dialogues, but we know Greek and Syriac authors wrote in that form as well. So that was one of my 2 courses. Right now I'm teaching a course on asceticism. I'm co-teaching it with a scholar of Jainism. And we're looking at asceticism as sort of a trans-historical, trans-religious phenomenon. And in the spring, I'm teaching the Greek exegesis course on the Gospel of John. So lots of different, I never get bored. So
a lot of fun stuff. Now, what advice would you give to women faithful of the Syriac Orthodox Church who may be interested in pursuing more research?
Excellent. Well, I think, we're blessed with a lot of beautiful translations from Sebastian Brock and Susan Harvey, and I think there'll be continual new publications as well from, of course, probably the listeners are aware of Gorgias Press. I think that's a great place to start, and I think we're rapidly working to try to get more and more of these texts out there. And I also think there are more opportunities to learn and work on Syriac as well. And I think, this is a great organization that's sort of bridging, I have a very strong belief that I think the Academy should continually reach out to the larger world and kind of share what we're doing here. So I think organizations like Urho, who are, bringing sort of access and attention to people who are working on this material and making the audience bigger. I would love somebody to buy my book one day. I don't think a lot of academic books get high circulation numbers. I don't think I'm going to have a bestseller anytime soon. But I do think, and I think maybe one of this pandemic that's going on right now, but use of Zoom is opening up. We have more lectures and you can go to and organizations that are working to bridge, divides between countries and time zones. And I think that might be one of the longstanding benefits is that these academic conferences will become more open spaces. And I can say late antiquity people, they love Twitter and social media. So you can certainly follow people working in the field.
Very good. I want to thank you so much to our audience, to you, Dr. Walsh, for taking the time to discussing your work and all your findings. And with that, we want to say glory to God and thank you for all for joining.
Bye.